All right. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Lindsay Gotanda, Deputy Superintendent for the district. We are so excited to have our last segment of our Talking to Your Children About Race and Racism with Dr. Howard. Just some housekeeping. We do have some opportunities for the audience to ask questions. So we do have a Q&A function, and those questions will show up and be populated. We actually have Dr. Ramirez, our coordinator of student mental health and support services, who is going to be monitoring some of those questions. We'll either answer them live or have Dr. Howard answer them live, or we will be able to type those answers into the chat. The Q&A. The chat feature actually is turned off, so there is no chat feature. So if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and put that into the question and answer. Tonight, we are so lucky to have Dr. Howard back with us. I'm going to read his bio. You've heard this, Dr. Howard, a couple of times about yourself already. But Dr. Howard is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. He is also the inaugural director of the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families, which is a transdisciplinary consortium of experts who examine academic, mental health, and social emotional experiences and challenges for California's most vulnerable youth populations. He's also the director of the UCLA Transformations of Schools, which serves as a thought partner for districts, counties, and states to pursue the whole child, whole community approaches to school systems improvement. And Professor Howard has published over 85 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and technical reports. He's published several best-selling books, among them Why Race and Culture Matters in Schools and Black-Mailed, Peril and Promise in the Education of African-American Males. His two most recent books, No More Teaching Without Positive Relationships and All Students Must Thrive, Transforming Schools to Combat Toxic Stressors and Cultivate Critical Wellness, have become must-reads for all educators. Dr. Howard is considered one of the premier experts on educational equity and access in the country, and he's also the director and founder of the Black Male Institute at UCLA, which is an interdisciplinary cadre of scholars, practitioners, community members, and policymakers dedicated to examining the nexus of race, class, gender of school-age youth. A native and former classroom teacher of Compton, California, Dr. Howard was named the recipient of the 2015 UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, which is the campus's highest honor of teaching excellence, and was named an American Educational Research Association, AERA, Fellow in 2017 for his exemplary research on race and equity. During the last 5 years, Dr. Howard has been listed by Education Week as one of the 60 most influential scholars in the nation informing educational policy, practice, and reform. And it is my true honor to have Dr. Howard here back with us again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gotanda. Good to see you as always. Thank you for your leadership of what you do, and thank you for your bold leadership in helping us to do all we can do to support all of our students. Glad to be here, honored, excited. Thank you for having me back. Want to thank all of you who have chosen to spend your Thursday evenings in this discussion of, we think the utmost importance around issues tied to how to talk to our children about race and racism. Not the easiest topic, but nonetheless, it's a topic that I think we all have to prepare ourselves for. And I truly want to give you some ideas, tips, recommendations, strategies, but I really want to have you, as much as you feel comfortable, participate in the chat or the Q&A, because I'm going to probably cover a lot of ground and a lot of territory here, but at any point in time, it'd be great to have you give your thoughts or your input or your questions, as well as your, disagreements or points of confusion or concern that I might raise. But nonetheless, this is a topic that I think we all can be better at, because it's not easy. By and large, in our society, we are not taught how to talk about race. We are not taught how to talk about racism, yet it's still in our midst. And we have to do, I think, a better job of how we engage our young people, because they are looking to us to be role models around this. They're looking for us to be guides. And sometimes we just don't know what to say, how to say it, so we just don't say anything at all. And part of one of my concerns is that us not saying anything at all can lead to further confusion for our young people. And you all have young ones, and I think they are sponges in so many ways. As you all know, they are listening to everything we are saying, even when we think they are not listening. They are watching what we do, even when we think they are not watching. And so we have to always be, careful and really observant about how we are helping them to talk about these issues. So I'm looking forward to it. We've had some great discussions with our previous sessions, and I think tonight will be no different. So again, let me just start off with a big thank you for being here. I feel like in many ways, many of you, most of you, probably all of you, you wouldn't be here tonight unless you thought this was important. And so that means a lot to me and to us, because there's so many other issues that we're focused on now as it pertains to reopening schools and staying safe and vaccinated and COVID and all the craziness that we've all been through for the past year. So the fact that you've taken time out of your schedules on a Thursday evening to be a part of this conversation means a lot, and I appreciate that. I thank you. And in so many ways, I think probably what tonight will be is about preaching to the converted. I don't think you would be here unless you thought this was important. Many of you are probably doing this very well already, and we could probably learn from some of you. But I think that all of us can learn and be better. I've got 4 kids myself. They're all grown now, but these were conversations that my wife and I had with our kids when they were younger, and in various ways we still have with them now as young adults. So I don't think it's a topic that you ever stop talking about. I think it's an issue that just sort of takes on different shapes and forms depending on the age of our children. And if you are parenting for the first time and you've got young ones for the first time, you're really in sort of uncharted territory. Like, how do I deal with this, right? For those of you who have been parenting for longer periods of time, obviously you've had some practice. I always say that our older kids are our guinea pigs. We kind of experiment on them, and the younger ones, we kind of are much more seasoned, or we're just tired, or we're seasoned and tired, and we kind of take the foot off the gas pedal. But nonetheless, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about your children's development. Thank you for being concerned about how we can help them all have these difficult and awkward conversations. So let's jump into it. Let me start you off with a slide here that gives you a snapshot of what our nation's schools have looked like over 3 different periods: 2002, 2012, and 2024. I share this slide because I oftentimes get this question: why do we need to have these conversations about race? Why should we talk to our students about racism? And I oftentimes tell folks, look around us. Our schools, much like our societies, are changing rapidly and changing in ways that we've never seen them change in our nation's history. So if you look at these data from the U.S. Department of Education, it gives you just a snapshot of the nation's schools. Now, mind you, this is the nation's schools. Schools in Los Angeles County, where we all are, tend to accelerate at a much more rapid pace in terms of demographics than the nation does. When you look at these data here, if you just look at your far left, it shows how the nation's white student population has been dramatically declining for some time. And so we're just looking at this over a 20-year window. And you see in 2002, white students were about almost 60% of the student population in American schools. 2012, that number had gone down to 51%. And in 2024, it's down to, it will be at 46%. You see the Black population has remained steady in that 15 to 17% range. But what you see with the next group, the Hispanic, and I'll use the term Hispanic today interchangeably with the term Latino or Latinx, is a term that now many people of Latin descent prefer to be used. So you look at the Hispanic or Latinx population has seen an uptick in the last 3 points from 2002 to 2012 to 2024, where the population will be close to 30%. You see the Asian Pacific Islander population has made some steady climbing from 4% up to 6%. And you see the American Indian Native Alaskan population has been steady about 1%. And one of our fastest growing groups, which I'll talk about in a moment, are individuals who are of mixed race backgrounds, where they have one parent from one ethnic racial group and the other parent from another ethnic racial background. That number has grown significantly over the last couple of decades. And again, this is a snapshot of what we see in our country. Los Angeles looks very different than this in some ways, in that the white population is dropping at an even faster rate. The Black population is much lower, and the Latinx population has grown increasingly along with the Asian Pacific Islander group. So I say that we cannot ignore issues of race because it's all around us. And our young people are going to grow up in a world where they're going to be in spaces, in places, in schools, and otherwise, where people are going to be across the ethnic and racial spectrum. Now, frankly, I think that's exciting. I think diversity is our strength as a nation. I think diversity is something that we should be proud of. I think diversity is something we should embrace. I think diversity is something we should celebrate. So while I feel that way, and I would imagine probably all of you feel that way, there are people out there who do not like these changes and do not like these shifts. And so we have to help our young people deal with the fact that there are people in our neighborhoods, unfortunately, in our schools, who have a very different reaction than we do about sort of the positivity that comes with diversity. And so that's why we continue to say that the data tells us that we are changing and changing rapidly. I'll give you another snapshot. From 1900 to 1970, if you look at the racial makeup of schools, we saw that in 1900, about 88% of our students were white. And even as recent as 1970, where many of us were going to school in the 70s, or where many of our parents were going to school, that, you know, most of our students in schools were white and about 20% of students were of color. But I'll take you to 2016, 2017, because that's an important year. What happened in 2016, 2017 was something that demographers have been expecting to happen for a long time, but they thought it would just happen in about the 2021, 2022 period, which is where we are now. And that was, for the first time in our nation's history, we enrolled more non-white kindergartners than we did white kindergartners. That had never happened in our nation's history. And again, it happened sooner than we had anticipated. So nationally, what we are seeing is something that we've seen here in Los Angeles County for several years now. And that is a larger non-white population in our schools than white populations. And part of what we're going to continue to see, I gave you on the previous slide a look at what our schools will look like in 2024, but take a look at what we will look like nationally in 2030, which is a brief 9 years from now. We will see that our largest subgroup will be our Latinx population, followed by white students. How about this one right here? 1 in 5 of our students in the nation will be students who are either immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. 10% will be Black, about 10% will be Asian. As I mentioned to you earlier, the Asia Pacific Islander population is much higher here in Southern California than it is nationally. And we see about 5% will be mixed race, and about 1% will be students who come from Native American backgrounds. So I show you this slide to say, this is the world that your young people will grow up in. This is the world your young people will be educated in. This is the world that your young people will ultimately go to college in. And even in a district that some might say is not as diverse as PVUVSD, you're going to see this. It's not a matter of if you'll see these changes, it's when you'll see these changes. And I think the sooner that we can begin to equip ourselves with the knowledge and the skills and the dispositions to have these conversations around this reality, I think the better. As I shared with a group of folks just a few weeks ago who are secondary parents, you look at the demographics of our colleges and universities, they're looking more and more like what you see on your far right, more diverse than ever before. And again, I think that's a great thing. I think that there is strength in diversity, there's power in diversity that we all learn when we're in a much more diverse setting. When people come from different backgrounds, speak different languages, different cultures, that's something that we should embrace. So I think the question becomes, we have to recognize that many adults avoid talking about race at all costs. Let me say that again. Many adults avoid talking about race at all costs. And as I've done this work for several decades, I have heard a number of responses across the gamut. You know, I don't think we should talk about race because that only creates more racism. I don't want to talk about race because I don't think it's important. I want to talk about race. I just don't know how to talk about race. Talking about race is too emotional and too volatile. I feel very sort of guilty when we talk about race. And so we do all kinds of things to not talk about this thing called race. And part of it is rooted in this idea, or rooted in this reality, I should say, that we have an ugly history in this country about race. We have a real sort of sordid past where it comes to the mistreatment of groups of color in this country. And most of the time we don't like to talk about that past because some people say, well, I wasn't there, so why should we talk about it? Or we don't like to talk about that past because then we might have to recognize that there are some groups who had advantages and opportunities that other groups have not had. Or it's just oftentimes so emotionally gut-wrenching to think that we would do the kinds of things that have been done to people of color in this country. So we find lots of reasons. Some are fair and justified, others I think are a little bit more questionable. But here's the rub. As much as we don't want to talk about it, the reality is this: many of our young people do want to talk about it because they see it around them. And for those of you who have young children, you know that they are literal in all their sort of understandings of the world. So when they see someone who's got a different skin color, they're curious. When they see someone who has different hair texture, they're curious. When they see someone who has different eye color, they're curious. And they come to us as the adults, the parents, to help them make sense out of what they see with these differences. So why does race matter? Again, because children notice it. And there's all kinds of research that comes from early childhood studies that shows that children notice race and racial differences earlier than many of their parents think. And that for many children as early as 2, 3, and 4 years old, they already pick up on racial differences. So one argument that some adults make, some parents make is, I'm not going to talk to my child about race because they don't even pick up on these issues of race, and talking about it only causes it to be more of an issue. I'll wait till they get older. I'll wait till they get 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, right? I had one parent a few weeks back said that her plan was to wait till her son got to high school. And I had to be the bearer of bad news. If you wait till your child gets to high school to start having conversations about race, you are late to the party. And so the goal here is to understand that the young people that we're raising, they are interacting in a world. They watch television shows, they interact on social media, they interact on learning platforms where they see people who are different. And that difference is, again, not a bad thing. What young people are trying to understand, and this is what psychologists have told us, is what does this difference mean? Why is my skin color different than her skin color? Why is her hair color different than mine? And that's what is so unique about young people. What I love about the young ones, because they have zero filter. They will say what they think. They will ask what is on the top of their minds. They will make it as literal as they can possibly make it. And part of what happens is that they take their cues from us. So if they ask a question and we don't seem to really engage in that issue, then all of a sudden the message that they take away is, uh-oh, this is something that I'm not supposed to talk about because mom and dad didn't respond. I use this example of what happened to me years ago when I was in a grocery store. And I think it's a prime example of the ways in which young children pick up on cues from parents. I was in a grocery store waiting to get checked out, and there was a white woman who was in front of me, and she had her little boy with her. The little boy probably was about 3 years old, maybe 3.5. And so she was holding him. And so as she was holding him, as they were in front of me, he was facing me. And so as he was facing me, we were playing peekaboo. I was looking at him, he was looking at me, we're laughing, we're kind of sort of joking around. And then out the clear blue sky, what the little boy told his mom, he said, "Mommy, look at the man, he's chocolate," pointing at me. So his mom turned around and saw me, and realizing that I was Black, she became immediately beet red. She said, "No." And she turned him around to face the front. Now you can imagine what happens when you take a 3-year-old who's curious about the chocolate man and tells mommy, and mommy turns around and sees the chocolate man, doesn't acknowledge the chocolate man, doesn't say anything about the chocolate man, and faces him to the front. So the more she tried to face him away from me, the more he kept kicking and screaming, trying to turn back toward me, right? Now, some might say, was that offensive? I don't think it was offensive because, again, he was 3, right? And issues around racism, let's be clear, are not something we're born with, they're learned. And just like they're learned, they can be unlearned. I think what this young boy was doing was he was making this about as literal of an association as he could. He saw someone, my skin complexion, and for him and his mind and his world, my skin color was synonymous with chocolate. So part of what happened in that moment, as his mother continued to sort of turn him away from me, he was crying and kicking and screaming, and he couldn't really get back to me because we were playing the game of peekaboo. The message that he could have very well picked up on was, I brought this up to my mom. I said he was chocolate, and mommy never said anything to me, never said anything to the man, just told me to basically turn around and not to address it. And I think about in that situation, what could that mom have said to her son? And a couple of things come to mind. She could have said, "No, he's not chocolate, but he's just a different color than you are. And that's okay. And we're all beautiful in our own right," right? She could have said something to say, "Well, no, he's not chocolate. Let's ask him what his name is," right? She could have taken a couple of different steps. But the message that was given to this young 3-year-old was that this is the topic that you don't touch. You don't acknowledge this difference, even though everybody sees it. We all know it's there, but we're going to act as if it's not important. And I think we don't do our young people a service when we don't engage in those conversations. So we need to understand they see it. And if they see it, we need to engage it, right? So why do we need to engage it? Because for our young people, it's about curiosity, right? I look at myself in the mirror every day and I see one thing. Then I go to this place called school or stores or grocery, and I see somebody else who has a very different hue than I have, different hair texture, different facial features. Kids are always trying to assess where they fit in relation to others. Sometimes it's not just about our facial features or our hair type. Sometimes it's about the fact that how come he has red shoes on? How come they're wearing blue pants and I wear brown pants? So whatever, the kids are always assessing their environment, and that's what makes them so intelligent. They're constantly trying to make sense out of the people and the places and the occurrences around them in their world. It's curiosity. And that's what we have to do, is tap into their intellectual curiosity, especially when they bring it to us. Part of what we have to recognize is that interrupting children's beliefs around bias and stereotyping is essential. So the earlier that we can do this, the better. Because remember, I talked about the fact that most of this is learned behavior. And we don't want our young people to learn the stuff that we associate with our racial sort of different classifications. And so what do I mean by that? The fact that we are racially different by itself is not a bad thing. Okay, let me just make that clear. The fact that we are racially different, I think, means nothing. Psychology, I mean, it's not psychologists, but medical doctors have done all kinds of studies that shows that at the core, we are like 99.9% similar across the board in terms of our human makeup, right? It's just that 0.01% about degrees of melanin that we have. So the fact that we're different racially is not a big deal. The problem is the stuff that we ascribe to our racial differences that makes it problematic. And we have, again, this long, ugly history of saying these nasty, negative things about different people across different ethnic racial groups. For example, right now in our country, right now in our city, we are seeing some horrific anti-Asian American sentiment being taking place in different parts of Los Angeles County. It's awful, it's unacceptable, it has no place. Why is that happening? Because we have ascribed this sort of negative sort of connotation of what's happening with coronavirus on people of Asian American descent. There's no place for that, right? So again, it's not that the difference by itself is a bad thing. It's that we as people, we tend to sort of make up these negative and nasty stereotypes that we place on people, and then people buy into that thinking, and it causes us to think about groups in various ways. Same thing we've done for a very long time in this country with Black people. There's a long sordid history around the ways in which we've oftentimes depicted Black people as being inferior to whites. Black people as being not willing to work hard, despite the fact we had 2 centuries of slavery, but that's a whole nother matter. How can the people who worked hard to build the country be lazy? But that's another conversation for another day, right? Same thing we do with people of Latin descent, right? We sort of position them as being other or being less than. We have a long, ugly history of making certain populations, primarily non-white populations, as being less than. And that stuff stays the course of time unless we intervene earlier, teach our children that that's not something good, that's not something positive to think. And this is where we can start those conversations. So how do we begin to move into this? I want to walk you through some things that we as adults have to be mindful of. We as adults typically don't want to see the matrix. Synonymous for saying we don't want to see race. So some of you are sitting right now thinking, okay, you're convincing me. I maybe should talk to my kids about it. It makes sense. It's important to do it early, but I just don't want to be the person because I don't know how, right? So we don't want to see it. We don't want to see it. And I think it starts with us as adults to figure out what is our mechanism when these issues come up, because we all have a go-to move to avoid this conversation. And we go into our flight, fight, freeze response, right? There's all kinds of research now that says that adults would much rather talk to their kids about the birds and the bees than talk to their kids about race and racism. It's just that frightening for some people, right? So what is your reaction to seeing the matrix? Some of us are like the rabbit here, right? We hear a conversation about race and we think, I hear my cat calling. I got to run and run quick, right? Some of us are like the porcupine. We get real prickly. I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. One of my best friends in high school was Black, so you can't say I'm a racist, right? Some of us are like the turtle. We kind of go into a shell. We say, I don't see color. Let me just act like I'm invisible, like they're invisible, and I don't have to have the conversation. Some of us become like the possum. We just say, maybe a person of color should talk about it. I'm going to plead the fifth and stay out of it. We all have our go-to moves, right? Some of us are like the tiger. We go into a very aggressive defensive mode to say, I completely deny it. The fact that you even raise it makes you the reverse racist because you even raise it about me. So we all have our ways of not seeing the matrix. But as hard as we try not to see the matrix, it doesn't go away. It's there and it matters and it's important. So we have to get better as adults, because sometimes the kids, I hate to say this, but this is true. Sometimes our students, our children are much more equipped and much more able and much more courageous to at least start these conversations than we might be as the adults. And we have to be better, okay? Now, one of my favorite books on this topic that I recommend for reading, it's an older book, but it's a classic. It's called The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon Allport. And I love this book because what Allport talks about is that how we learn how to be prejudiced. And he breaks down the term prejudice, to judge before knowing. And he says the human condition forces us to make these split-second decisions before we have accurate information. We see somebody, and social psychologists have said sometimes in the first 9 seconds, we size somebody up, we look at their height, we look at their dress, we look at their skin color, we look at their gender, and we make associations about who we think they are, how intelligent they are, if they're a threat, if they're not a threat. We do this all the time. This is just the human condition, to categorize people, to put people into our schema. Our schemas are what we know and how we categorize our world around us, right? But part of what Allport talks about in this work is that if we don't sort of disrupt some of the stuff that society tells us about certain groups, we will easily buy into some of these preconceived notions, negative stereotypes. So he says we must do 3 things. We must work intently and intentionally around stopping, reflecting, and reacting. Stopping, let me see, where did that thought come about that particular group of people? Reflecting, where might I have gotten it from and why I need to somehow think about that, and react in a different way by judging that person based on who that person is as an individual, and not stereotyping or not generalizing that person out to the entire group of people, okay? Now, I'm raising this because for many of our young people today, they are inundated with lots of messages and lots of images about the racial realities of our world, but they see it in lots of places that we didn't see them in when we were growing up. For many of us, if we just are frank about it, we grew up in pretty segregated communities. Most of us probably went to pretty racially segregated schools. And so there was not a lot of difference we had unless we were bused to other communities or unless there was a Black family that moved into our neighborhood, or a Latinx family who moved into our neighborhood, or an Asian American family who moved into our neighborhood, but there was sort of minimal diversity. So we have to look at who and where are the culprits that our children are learning about race from. And some of it we're not always in tune with, right? So for example, if you look at this far left, TV, movies, Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, Prime Video, you name it. There are streaming platforms that many of our kids are far more efficient at navigating than we are as adults. And they're watching movies, they're watching documentaries, even our young ones, they're seeing cartoons. All these different mechanisms are giving a way to our young people to navigate the world. And so we have to be careful about what those messages might be. Our music that our kids have in the ecosystem around them. Sometimes the music gives them messages and lessons about sort of who and where they see certain people and what they think about them. As much as I hate to say it, even sports, our kids watch us watching sports, playing sports. They watch the people they see on TV, and sometimes their notions of people who are different come from who they see playing football, basketball, soccer, tennis, golf, you name it. We make associations about people sometimes through our watching of sports. And that one at the bottom is a real prickly one. How about current events? The current events always give us a landscape of issues that we see as it pertains to racial and ethnic diversity. And we have to ask, are our kids watching that, and what their takeaways are from that? School is another place that our young people are learning about issues tied to race because their peers tell them things and they say things. And another area that I don't have here, but that is equally as important and it's harder for folks to come to grips with, is that even our parents can be influencers on our children. So grandparents. And grandparents may have some very outdated, problematic, narrow notions of people who are different. And sometimes, if we're just being brutally honest, sometimes our parents say things about certain groups that are just not okay. And we need to cover our children's ears up so that they don't repeat some of the things that they hear their grandparents saying. I always tell the story that I have my grandmother who passed away about 6-7 years ago. Loved her dearly, but my kids will tell you that she was an equal opportunity racist in her commentary. You would walk in and she would start going in on X, Y, Z group immediately because she was a woman of her time and that was the world she was raised in. But a lot of things she said did not want my children to repeat. really did not want my children to hear. And I'm sure many folks out there who are listening to this know what I mean, because you got parents or grandparents yourselves who have some really problematic views of certain groups of people. So let's just be frank about where our young people are hearing some of these messages, because if we don't monitor or at least try to have some control over where and how our kids are getting these messages, our kids will say things to us that will completely blow us away. Like, where did you hear that? Or who told you that? And I'm saying we live in an information age, and our young people are getting information from so many sources in so many ways that sometimes we're just not even aware. Not that we can control all of it, but just to have a mindfulness and awareness of where they're getting this content information. So I want to make sure I stop and have some pause points. So we've gone for the first 30 minutes. Dr. G, do you want to pause and see if we can answer some questions before I continue on with some steps that we can take?
I would love to. So this is from a parent who says that they get triggered when they talk about the injustice of racism and prejudice. And my 6-year-old thinks that I'm mad and is scared of my scary eyes. How can I talk about it without being triggered? I'm a person of color with a mixed race child.
Great question. I think that you have to be honest, and you have to tell, your child in as developmentally and appropriate way as you can, that when you see people being harmed, it makes you angry. When you see people being treated in a way that's not nice, it makes you angry. I don't think you need to apologize for your trigger. Your trigger is a natural human reaction to something that you see that really, really infuriates you. And so I think that our kids can learn from that when you see some form of injustice being done, it should make you mad. When you see someone who's being treated in an unjust way, you should be upset. Now, how you use and channel that anger is the subsequent conversation, that we don't go out and harm other people, or we don't go out and do destructive things. But part of the problem we have in our society today, I think, is that we see injustice and it doesn't move anybody emotionally. And we never want to be that place as a society where we see all kinds of racial mistreatment and racial discrimination, and we just kind of think, oh, well, that's not my problem, it's somebody else's. So I would say that you've got to explain to your child that, yes, this is wrong, and nobody should be treated differently because their skin color is of a different hue, or because their language is different, or because their hair type, or because whatever it is about them, when they've done nothing to warrant such mean and cruel treatment, that they are therefore treated in violent ways. So I think you have to explain that, but being honest about it is a good tactic.
Awesome, thank you. So this question says, when faced with implicit bias in the selection of our PTA board, what is the next course of action a parent of color can take to promote inclusion and diversity training within the school community?
Yeah, so here's the thing that happens. I work with a lot of districts and I get that question a lot. So we've done implicit bias. And so what's next? As if we've kind of checked the box, and how do we kind of move beyond it? And the question I throw back at folks, as a former classroom teacher, as someone who sat on different committees and boards that are associated with schools, I said, what do we do about something like reading? We don't just say with reading and teaching of reading, we give our teachers a PD about reading and we check the box and we're done. We make it a point of emphasis every single year. We come back to the fact that we've got to be better with our reading proficiency. We've got to get our kids better in terms of their reading scores. We've got to get our kids better with their reading comprehension. We have to help our kids build more robust vocabulary. It becomes an ongoing process and an ongoing mechanism where we place the focus on reading or math every single year. It's not a one-time deal. I would make the argument that same thing has to happen with implicit bias, that you can consistently stay with it. And some of the things that you can do to assess if you're making any progress is looking at some of your data. And I think some of the data that's important to look at, for example, is on school discipline, right? One of the areas where implicit association is kind of really tied in with, in terms of where it's greater, is when we see disproportionality, racial disproportionality, for example, with regard to school discipline. There are districts across this country. Let me stay here in this county. There are districts in this county that have some discipline data that are deeply troubling, where Black students, for example, or Latinx students are maybe 10, 15% of the student population, but make up 3, 4, 5 times the number of students who are actually being suspended. So if we don't see those suspension and those expulsion rates going down, that may raise a question. If we look at our gifted and talented programs and we see very little representation of Black and brown students, that may mean we need to continue to do the work around implicit bias. If we're looking at who's in our AP and honors classes and we don't see the representation of certain students, that may raise a question. So now I think it's the application of the work, right? You can go through the training, but now let's look at our processes, right? Who gets opportunity? Who are the counselors recommending for college programs? Who's on the homecoming court, right? Who are the students who are oftentimes elevated with opportunities, and who are the ones who rarely get those opportunities? Because that's where implicit bias rests, in opportunities, and how we see some students are worthy of those opportunities, but other students, for a variety of reasons, just don't seem to be getting the same opportunity. So we have to look at our practices, we have to look at our data. And if you really want to know, and this is something I think more districts are doing, as a matter of fact, we did this with Culver City schools just last year prior to COVID. They do, at the high school level at least, they do student surveys and interviews. They talk to students at the school and students who are recent graduates from the school to say, what would you say was the racial climate here at Culver City High School? And some of those data have been really eye-opening, because the students are saying, yeah, here's where we face microaggressions. Here are the comments that have been said about us. Look at our textbooks. Most of the authors are white. Look at on the walls. We don't have any people of color on the walls. Look at our mascot. All these things that become points of that people who are white don't even think about, but kids of color think about it all the time. They see it and they're trying to say, how can we be different? So I think there's some ways that we can begin to concretize this work by looking at specific areas.
Awesome. And just as a point of clarification, question is, when you say Latinx, do you include them in non-white?
Yes, I do. Yes, okay. I do.
Perfect. So this is a good question. A parent says, unlike how I was raised, I don't want to teach my children to be colorblind, as that dismisses the lived experience of people of color in our country. But when there's a lack of racial diversity in the community and the district, how do I teach them to see color and celebrate and appreciate diversity without making a few minoritized students in our community feel even more othered? I know it's hard when the only fill in the blank person in the room to constantly feel hyper aware of the fact. For example, we talked about anti-Black racism. My son immediately thought of and brought up his only Black friend. I just don't want him to tokenize his few peers of color.
Yeah, these are excellent questions. Thank you for that one. And that's a really sort of sensitive area, because, you know, you're right. You don't want your children to grow up colorblind. I'll talk about that shortly. But when you do mention it, kids are aware of the fact that there's only one Black kid in the class. And do I say something about it or do I not say something about it, right? Because if I say something about it, does it make my friend feel isolated, excluded, different, right? If I don't say anything about it, does it then appear as if I'm not even recognizing the fact that he's different? So I think it's kind of a nuanced way that we have to understand it. So for example, I tell adults that the last thing you want to do is ever put that lone Black kid, the lone Latinx kid, the lone Asian kid on the spot to be the spokesperson for all people who are of their racial or ethnic background. That's the worst thing you want to do, right? You know, and my kids who went to schools that were largely white and Asian talked about the fact that they despised when there were conversations that arose that had to do with Black people, because they felt like their teachers oftentimes sort of directly or indirectly sort of put their attention on them. Like, what do you think about, you know, issues tied to slavery? Or what do you think about, you know, celebrating Black History Month? And that's just the worst feeling that a student can have when, you know, issues come up. Like, you know, right now I mentioned the fact that we have these issues around this anti-Asian violence that we see happening. The last thing you want to do is ask an Asian student, what do you think about the anti-Asian violence that's going on? You don't want to put kids on the spot that way. That makes them feel even more isolated. I think as it pertains to your son or daughter or your child who's younger, I think that you should be proud of the fact that at least that they notice it and they are curious about it. And I would say, let that student who is the lone or one of the few, let them bring it up. If they don't bring it up, then you don't bring it up. If they bring it up, then don't try to dismiss it and say it's not important. Then you have a conversation. I think kids have these conversations more amongst themselves than we even know, right? I think when kids say things, sometimes they say things that are signs of support and signs of sort of endearment, but there are times where it gets ugly and kids say some mean things and kids say some hurtful things. And I think if you're a parent of a child who is one of the only fill in the blank, then you should start having that conversation with that child now. Are kids saying things to you? Do they make comments about you? Because sadly, what happens for many kids of color, especially when they're in numerically small numbers, they just learn how to just accept those comments as just part of being at the school. One of the things that pains me now, years and years after my kids were young kids, is my middle son tells us, he says, you know, we heard these comments all the time. And it pains me because my response is, well, why didn't you tell us? Talking about, you know, me and my wife. And he says, if we had told you all every time somebody made a joke or a racial comment or a racial sort of innuendo, you would have been at that school every day. And it's sad that when you're the only or one of the few that you just come to normalize the fact that there are going to be these kinds of environments that just make your race a thing in ways that are not always comforting to you, right? So I think it's important to start talking to your kids now, if they're one of the onlys, because some kids have a much greater bandwidth to handle those things. Others are not as equipped, and it can be psychologically damaging, and it can be emotionally challenging to constantly have to be in the face of that. And let's be frank, you know, in some cases, we know there's lots of racial bullying that happens in schools, and kids are made fun of and talked about explicitly, right? And overtly because of their racial differences. So I think the conversations are what's important here to make sure that we're not assuming that there's nothing happening because my child is saying nothing about it. I think we have to engage as much as we can.
So one more question. How do we speak to people who are afraid if there is more equity and opportunity that will mean that their kids will lose out?
Yeah, this is another good, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, so in other words, if, you know, we have more equity, then that means other kids are gonna lose out because it gives opportunity for more kids.
That's right. This is one of the things that scares a lot of folks, right? I think that what we cannot do, look, folks, we don't want to be what are called resource hoarders. And that's what we see happen in some schools. There are groups of parents or groups of teachers who want to hoard all the resources for their children, their friends' children, their nieces, their nephews. So there's a finite amount of resources, and we just have to do everything we can to make sure that we keep it for us. That is not who we raise our kids to be. We don't raise our kids to be gluttonous or to be greedy. So why would then we turn around and be the same way? And that's the fear that I think that exists, unfortunately, in far too many schools. People, look, let's just be frank for a second. For those of you, you all have young children, but we are at a place now. And if for those of you who have older children, you can appreciate what I'm about to say here, that let's just talk about college admissions right now. College admissions has become an increasingly competitive endeavor. You all saw the mess that happened a couple of years ago where people were paying literally millions of dollars to get their kids into the college of choice. It is an increasing, it has gone mad in terms of what parents will do to get their children into the college of choice. So that's part of what this issue is here now. People are afraid of equity because it means for some people, well, wait a minute. If now we're saying we should make sure we have more Black and Latinx students in the AP and honors class, does that mean that my son or my daughter may not get an opportunity? Well, what about we make the argument that we should have additional AP and honors classes so we don't have a scarcity of opportunity? Because whenever there's a scarcity of resources, people get ugly and people start to hoard, and people do whatever they can to keep people who they perceive to be threats away. Equity should not have to be a zero-sum game where if I give something to them, that means something is being lost for my son or my daughter or my student. Part of what we have to think about is how do we create these true democratic opportunities where, you know, we don't have just one AP biology class. What if we had two? So if we've got enough students who are equally qualified and able to compete in those courses, we shouldn't have to try to see how we get 60 kids into a spot into 30 spots. Maybe we have to put pressure on the board and the powers that be to say, look, if there's 60 kids who are qualified, then there should be 2 classes so that there can be ample opportunity. That's the kind of creative thinking that we have to do, not pushing people out, not saying that, you know what, you don't deserve to be in. We have to be much more thoughtful about the fact that the messages that we oftentimes send our students, our children, may run counter to the very things that we do when it comes to looking out for them. And we just can't be that way. We've got to be consistent because far too many people have worked hard and played by the rules. And the last thing anybody wants to see happen is when you do all the things that you've told me to do, now all of a sudden people have not given you opportunity because they're hoarding them for folks over here who are not quite as equipped. So that one's a really touchy issue. for all the reasons I just mentioned, but I think it's still something we have to be better at, to recognize that if we believe in merit, then we should believe in merit. And we shouldn't have to believe in the fact that I want my son or daughter to get these opportunities because I know that they're important for him or her. If there's somebody else who's more deserving of that opportunity, then they should have it. But let's think about creating more opportunity across the board instead of trying to put taking so few opportunities with more and more students who are worthy of them. So great question. So let's move on. Keep the questions coming, please. I'll go through another set of slides and then we can open up for some more questions, okay? Good conversation. So I want to walk you through now sort of 7 or 8 steps, tips, do's, and don'ts that you should be mindful of as you think about engaging these conversations with your students. And these are not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. Many of you are already doing some of these things, and even as we go to Q&A shortly in another 20 minutes or so, it'd be great to hear you share what you're doing and how you're doing these different things, because I think there's no right or wrong way. So I've got these 8 tips. Here's tip number 1. Just understand that there's no perfect way to have the discussion, okay? What do I mean by that? Oftentimes we want to say, okay, I'm gonna plan it for Monday at 5 o'clock. I'm gonna sit my child down and we're gonna sit and talk, and I'll say this set of things and then she'll say that. And we wanna script every part of the conversation. Usually, folks, it does not happen that way. It happens when you least expect it. Your child will say something completely out the blue. And I think when your child brings that up, you have to go with it, right? Like, Mom, how come there's only one black kid in my class? Okay, I didn't expect that coming today, but let's talk about it. You know, I'm not sure, but how do you think that one black kid feels in your class? Do you see anybody treat him differently? Do you see people talk to him differently? He deserves to be treated like all the other kids. He shouldn't be treated any differently because his skin color is different, right? Or, Mom, how come some kids talk and they have an accent? Well, let's understand that language is a part of who we are. And there's lots of different languages across the world. And some people speak one language, some people speak a lot of different languages. And that's a pretty cool thing, that you can speak 2 or 3 different languages. And if you can speak different languages, sometimes you have an accent because it's more tied to one of the languages you spoke first. We just have to explain as much as we can in an appropriate fashion based on age. But there is no perfect way to have the discussion. Sometimes we're thinking that we want to watch a movie and that movie's going to open up the conversation. There are times that we think we're ready to talk about it, but our kids aren't. So know that you don't have to hold yourself to this standard of getting it right the first time, got to stick the perfect landing, got to get the right script, got to find the right point of entry. It's just not that way. Issues around race, let it happen organically, let it flow. And one of the best ways to have these conversations is ask questions. Well, what do you think? How would you feel if you were the only kid in your class who had blonde hair? How would you feel if people said, you have black tennis shoes, if they said the kids who have on black tennis shoes can't play with us? How would that make you feel? The thing I love about young kids, like the 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids, they are big on fairness. They are big on not being mean to other people. So they really get this idea of mistreatment in ways that oftentimes our older kids are kind of just over with, right? So the thing you want to help your kids understand is, how would you feel? This is how we build empathy, right? How would you feel if somebody said, if your last name was blank, that you couldn't play with other kids? Well, how would you feel if they said anybody whose last name if your last name is a particular last name, that you can't play Foursquare? Help them feel what it feels like to be the other, and that can start to really build a sense of empathy. And that's when you see that our young people do not engage in this discriminatory treatment toward their peers. Okay. Let's go to tip number 2. Look, folks, we're amazing people. You're phenomenal parents. You are smart. You're resourceful. You do it all. But look, it is okay not to know everything, okay? And I think sometimes we feel like as parents, we have to know it all. We have to know the right answer. We have to give the appropriate response. We have to get it perfect. And look, give yourself a break. It's okay not to know everything. It's okay to say phrases like, I don't know. It's okay to say, I'm not sure. It's okay to say, let's find out together. Because again, it lets your kids know that you're being honest. Like, you know, how do kids feel if they're the only Latinx, the kid who speaks Spanish? I don't know how that feels because I was not that kid who was the only one who speaks Spanish. But I would imagine that it wouldn't feel good if people were laughing at you. I would think that it wouldn't feel good if people were pointing at you and saying things about you that you didn't know what they were saying. So you don't know what it's like to be the other in some instances, but maybe you can compare it to something else, right? I don't know how it's like. I don't know what it feels like to be the only Black student in the class, but I do know once when I was in high school, I was the only girl who was in a particular class, and I didn't like the fact that nobody wanted to work with me or nobody wanted to be in my group. So you have to say, I don't know, but maybe if there's something that's a parallel kind of connection, you can use that. But the key is to let your student know that sometime we're going to kind of explore this stuff together and we can find out answers together. And as mom, dad, you know, grandmother, grandfather, whoever the caregiver is, that we're not all knowing as our kids might think that we are. Now, the young ones might be shocked that we don't know something because they think we know everything. The older ones think we don't know a damn thing, but that's a whole nother conversation. But the bottom line is we need to be mindful and aware of the fact that it's age appropriateness in terms of, you know, how we have the conversation with our students, okay? Let's go to tip number 3. Look, folks, this one gives me pride and it says a lot about what you all are already doing. And we're looking at, and there's lots of data now, research that shows that today's children are much more comfortable with diversity than we were at that same age. Think about that, right? For a lot of the tweens, high school age, being woke is like a thing now. You want to be woke, meaning being woke means that you're not racist. Being woke means you're not homophobic. Being woke means that you're not transphobic or discriminatory towards any group. I love that about these young people today, because the goal is, how do we create a much more, you know, inclusive society? How do we create and live in a much more diverse society? And so your young children, most of your children, hopefully all of your children, will grow up in that same ecosystem where they are socializing each other to say, we don't treat people differently, right? We are seeing that kids now are much more likely to have cross-racial friendships, cross-racial relationships. And that is a sign that we are not, our kids are not stuck on the stuff that we were stuck on generations ago. And think about it, it's really kind of a natural progression. When you think about the fact that our children, I think, are in a much better place and are much more comfortable with diversity than we were, because guess what? We were much more comfortable with diversity than probably our parents were. And if you go one step further, our parents were probably much better than their parents were. And so I like to believe that with each passing generation, we're becoming more comfortable with diversity. We're more comfortable talking about it. Part of what we're doing in some small way, not as much as we like to see, but we're starting to see greater degrees of integration on the edges than we have in years gone by, right? And part of what we know is that one of the things that reduces prejudice, hear me out on this, one of the things that reduces prejudice is intergroup contact. That the more people have in close proximity with people who are different, that reduces prejudice. We see this all the time on our college campus when it comes to dormitories. We see that a lot of our students at the college at UCLA, when they are in close proximity to people who are different from them, they oftentimes find out that they have far more in common than they ever would have thought. But they just never had the opportunity to be in close proximity with a white person because they grew up in a school that was all Black and brown. Or the white student realizes, wow, my family has just as much in common with your family, despite the fact that I'm white and you're Korean American, right? We let those stereotypes sort of be sort of dividing factors between us coming together. But when we are really placed in situations where we have to talk to each other, radical idea, right? Learn about each other, really radical idea, right? Get to know each other. We begin to recognize that the racial parts of our identities is a part of who we are, but it's not the sum total of who we are. That we have interests, we have hopes and dreams and hobbies and family members and likes and dislikes, that's the stuff that we want to get to. But sometimes we're so fixated on the racial identity that we never allow ourselves to kind of get to know who the people are. Today's young people are much more comfortable with diversity. They're much more at ease having these conversations. It just freaks us out sometimes, but I think we need to lean into their comfort, lean into their willingness to be okay, understanding diversity, and see that as a strength, as a sign that we're doing something, even if it's not consciously doing it, we're doing something that's telling our young people that diversity is a good thing. And I think we have to take a bow for that, okay? Let me move into one more tip. Tip number 4, and I think this is perhaps one of the most important ones. And I stress this a lot because folks don't seem to recognize that you can really, really send powerful messages to your students, to your child, without ever saying a word explicitly. And one of the most important ways you can do that is by be a role model. Look at your social circle and think about it. Who are the 4, 5, 6, 7 people who you spend most time with that are, say, not family, right? And if you have a group of friends or a social circle that's pretty diverse, and those folks, you know, spend time with or around your family, that's sending a powerful message to your little ones that diversity is something that you just don't espouse to believe in, but it's really sort of endemic to how you live your life because you've got friends who are across the racial and ethnic spectrum. So developing a network of friends and colleagues from across racial backgrounds sends a powerful message to kids that, look, I have friends and I get along with people who are different from me. I'm not afraid of differences. I think it's important to be able to not just tell our kids that diversity is important, but to manifest it, to show it, to demonstrate it in our interactions. If we are with our kids and we're in a diverse neighborhood and we look scared and we're clutching our purses, guess what? We're sending the message to our children that when they're in diverse neighborhoods, they should be worried, they should be scared. If your kids are out and you're at the park walking and they see you strike up a random conversation with someone of a different ethnic or racial group and you seem very much at ease, that's sending a message that there's no reason to be scared of somebody. You can strike up a conversation with somebody across the racial or ethnic spectrum, and that can be completely okay. Remember, our young people are watching us. They're listening to us. When young people say these awful things, it's typically because they've heard an adult say that same thing. So we need to watch when we're on our phone calls. What are we saying? Because sometimes we have these little sort of off-cuff jokes that we make about some group. Guess what, folks? Our kids hear our comments sometimes, right? Being mindful of what we're watching. I'm sure many of you do, right? If you watch movies, be careful about what kind of language is in those movies and what kind of sort of racial epithets might be hurled in those movies because kids are watching. I just think that the way we embody our day-to-day lives is a huge, and I do mean huge, way to sort of show to our young people that diversity is important, that diversity matters, okay? Let me go to tip number 5, and we'll see if we got any questions because I want to not get too far ahead without getting some more questions. Listen, folks, this is one that folks frequently get a little bit confused about because I've had people tell me over the years that, look, I was always taught to not see color and to just judge people for who they are as people. And I do think at the core that that's a great attribute. I think at the core, that's where we ultimately want to be. We want to create the kind of world that people's race and ethnicity doesn't matter. But we can't get there yet because people still live in this world where we don't acknowledge the fact that there are different kinds of advantages and opportunities that have been afforded to some groups compared to others. So I think while colorblindness on the surface appears to be benevolent and appears to be sort of what we want to be, we still must do better to recognize that people's race and ethnicity matters. Okay, why does that matter, you say? Because if someone were to say to me, Tyrone, you know, Tyrone, I never even noticed the fact that you were Black. Yes, you did. You saw me. I'm Black, been Black all my life, want to stay Black the rest of it. So don't say that you don't see a core part of who I am. To say that you don't see that is to almost render me invisible, or to say that something that really shapes my life on a day-to-day basis, you're going to say that it's not important, right? And I love the comment that Trevor Noah makes is people who say that they're colorblind, what do you do when you come to a red light? Do you just go straight through it? No, we see color all the time. It's acknowledging color, but not being fixated on color. I like to compare colorblindness much in the way like I like to think about issues tied to being, say, gender blind. What would it look like if I walked into a room full of people, men and women, and I said, wow, you know what? I never even noticed if there were men or women. I just saw people. And the women who are here, I didn't even notice you were women. To say that I don't notice and recognize that you're women is a huge, huge slight on a big part of who you are. Because as women in this society, we know that women have to think about everything about how they live their lives, Where am I going? Is it safe? How am I dressed? How do I present myself? I don't want to be too friendly. I don't want to come off as too sort of, non-friendly. Women have to think about so much because we live in a patriarchal society that is constantly scrutinizing women. So therefore, to say that I don't see your gender means that I don't see a core part of how you have to navigate the world every single solitary day. For those of you who have daughters and sons, the conversations you have with your daughters about safety and be careful where you go and who are you with and don't go alone, those are different conversations we have with our daughters compared to how we have them with our sons, because we know that our sons are not at risk for some of the same kinds of issues that our daughters are with. So to say and to know that we have differences in how women have to navigate the world around us, and then to say, I don't see that, that's saying you don't see a big part of how I have to think about the world I live in every single day. Same thing with race. To say I don't see your race means that when I think about, as a Black man, some of the same things that women think about: where am I going? Am I safe? Who's around? Is this okay? Be careful what you say. Watch who you say it to. All those things shape the experiences of people of color in ways that only people of color can really identify and relate to. So we don't want to say we don't see it. The goal is to acknowledge it, because we live in a society that continues to sort of make racism, unfortunately, still present in our society. So we don't want to say we don't see it. We acknowledge it, we recognize it, and try to best understand those experiences so we can move towards eradicating any forms of discrimination and racism. Hope that makes sense. Let's pause point for a second. Dr. G, what you got for me?
Okay, what is the best way to approach the parent of a child or a school employee who may have said something racist and or improper to a student of color?
You just say it. I think, but I think you have to be fair. You think about the saying that, it's not always what you say, but how you say it. And I think part of what has to happen is that frequently when we feel like our children have been targeted or victims of some type of hurtful words, you're angry and you want to do anything in your power to come to your child's defense. And you don't want to see your child hurt or slighted or left out or excluded. So your first thing is, I need to go tell that parent what their child did to my parent. So yeah, so at some level, you got to really kind of bring the temperature down a little bit. Not to say that you still don't have to hold the way you feel about it, but sometimes if you come in a way that's very aggressive, it puts the other person in a very defensive mode and they're ready to come at you in the same way. I think you have to think about the tone, the tenor, and explain to that parent, listen, let me tell you who I am. I am so-and-so's mother, so-and-so's father, and he shared with me that your son or your daughter said X, Y, or Z. I find that deeply problematic. I find it really disrespectful. And I think that you need to help us understand how we can rectify this so this does not happen again. I think you have to try to be as calm and as direct as you possibly can, because in some cases, the kids are repeating things that they don't even know what they mean. They're saying things that they've heard. And so the parent is oftentimes caught off guard. They're trying to explain, my kid wouldn't say that. Well, you don't know what your kid would say when they're out of your presence. So let's try to get to the bottom line. My kid would not make something up that I knew was hurtful to him or her or them. So the bottom line is, let's try to get to the bottom line. That's if the adult is talking to an adult about something that the kid has said. Let's take that next step where the adult, let's say it's the teacher, has said something. Then we can have a very different conversation. Because at that point in time, what we need to do is have an adult to adult conversation about the fact that you said something, whether jokingly or not, that is just deeply, deeply troublesome and disrespectful. And I just don't have any tolerance for that kind of comment being shared in my child's presence. So I'm going to respectfully ask you, A, to not say it again. And in some cases, you might go so far as to say you might even need to apologize because it was that hurtful to my son or my daughter. Now, oftentimes in those cases, the person who may have made the comment may say something like, well, I didn't even know I said that. I didn't mean it that way, or it wasn't my intent. And let us be clear that we make the distinction that intent doesn't always equal impact. So just because you didn't intend to do it or intend to say it doesn't mean that the impact has still not been there. So I can walk by someone and accidentally step on their foot. That may not have been my intention, but rest assured that they still feel the pain from me stepping on their foot, accidentally or not. So we have to make sure that when these issues come up, that we tell our children to bring them to us, let us have these conversations with adults, and then hopefully the adults can come to a clearer understanding about why certain behaviors or certain comments are not okay.
So, thank you. Okay, so I think you kind of answered this a little bit, but it was related to like discipline. But what are some of the best ways to implement diversity education into our elementary schools curriculum activities? I'm of the opinion that it's something that we should do on a regular basis, right? It's something that we should infuse into our curriculum as opposed to just doing an assembly once a year. But I'd love to hear what you would have to say.
Amen, amen, amen. I think, look, one of my upcoming slides will be focused on children's literature, multicultural children's literature as what should be a staple in all schools. Let me say this again, a staple in all schools. I think that we do a disservice to our students, not just kids of color, but also to white kids, when we don't introduce them to a rich and wide array of different people, backgrounds, languages, experiences. Look, there's a huge body of research in the corporate world and in the education world about how diversity, that people who grow up with an understanding and a healthy understanding of diversity, they are more productive. They are able to have better work relationships, better personal relationships. This is something that will benefit our young people, regardless of their race or ethnicity, for years to come, for their entire lives. So yes, the school curriculum should be both windows and mirrors. What do we mean by that? We want our curriculum to not just be windows where kids look out and they learn about so many different people and histories and perspectives and languages and customs and culture. That's the beauty of living in a global democracy. You learn about all the different ways of how people live across the globe. But our curriculum should also be mirrors where kids look at the textbooks, they look at the literature, they look at the novels, they look at the examples, and they see people who look like them. They see families who resemble theirs. They hear languages that may be familiar to them. They see customs that they practice. Unfortunately, for many kids of color, most kids of color, I would argue, school curriculum has been mostly about them learning about other people, but not learning about themselves. So I think you're right that we shouldn't just limit conversations about Black History Month to Black people then. We shouldn't limit conversations about, Hispanics only during Hispanic Heritage Month. Same thing for Asian API month, right? That should be something that we're incorporating in all 9 months of the year. I make the argument that it's important for teachers and leaders to make sure that our libraries have diverse literature, that the must-read, that the mandatory reads are from diverse authors. Look at the characters, that they're diverse, that we see not just racial and ethnic diversity, but students with disabilities, kids with disabilities. That's the full range of that we see parents, we see households where you see parents who are same sex. We are trying to shield our children from a world that is to me, rich and diverse around them every single day. And I think that to not engage them with that, I think can be really hurtful to their development, short-term and long-term.
Thank you. So Parent says, I'm Mexican, came to this country 3 years ago. As an outsider, it has been difficult and interesting to adapt myself, learn, and understand the very complex issue of racism in this country. I would have been the mom in the supermarket that wouldn't allow my toddler to talk to you in the supermarket, not because I don't want to have the conversation, but I'm scared to be offensive towards you. I've learned that there are many unwritten rules of how to treat the minorities, specifically African Americans in this country. So my question to you is, will everyone be open to hear the conversation you explained in the supermarket with my child and not be offended by it? I feel sometimes I am walking on eggshells trying to be open to talk about race, but at the same time politically correct and not to offend anyone.
Yeah, another great comment. So that's excellent on so many levels. I appreciate your frankness. Who was that from, Lindsay? Can we put somebody on the spot for a second? I think
that was an anonymous. It was really anonymous.
Anonymous, that's right. Thank you, Miss Anonymous, for being vulnerable and putting yourself out there. So let me just be fair here. Let me be fair. Let me be frank, because I'm presenting these issues, but they're complicated, and I'm presenting these issues and they're layered. And you could have Tyrone Howard come talk to you and give you these tips right now. And you could bring somebody else in tomorrow that would give you something that runs completely counter to this, because there's no set way of how these things can be done. Now, I spoke about the example in the store. That's what worked for me as Tyrone Howard, somebody who's comfortable in my own skin and understands some of the sociological and psychological ways in which race can be so explosive. But let's say you had somebody else who was African-American, and that young child said that could have caused a major explosion. So by no stretch of the imagination am I speaking for all Black people in terms of how they would have handled that matter. I just know for me, that's how I would have preferred to handle. So I completely understand. I wasn't mad or angry at the parent who turned her son around. I understood why she did it, because here's what happens in our country. As default, we rather say, I just rather not say anything at all than to say the wrong thing. I get that. That's a protective measure, right? That's like, okay, I could turn around and try to rectify the situation, but I wasn't planning for this conversation. I don't have a script. I don't have a go-to line. I'm trying to read this person's sort of body language, facial expression. And because I'm not able to come up with something quick, let me just turn around and not see him or her or them and not focus on that at all. That's an easier way to take, as opposed to, and a safer way to take, as opposed to taking that risk and saying something. So I get it, but I think it just speaks to the levels in which we have to understand so much of these issues, so many of these issues are layered, and they're going to vary from person to person. I want to stress that point, that the person on the one hand who's very much comfortable talking about issues of race, you can find another person who doesn't want to talk about it at all, right? And that both are fine, right? And the thing about it is, we're oftentimes, I love the comment about we're walking on eggshells, because we don't know who those persons are. And so therefore we're thinking, I want to raise this issue, but is it going to be okay? And then we're holding our breath, and if that person is receptive, we can exhale because it wasn't a landmine, right? But then the next person could be, highly offended. Why would you ask me that as a person who's Mexican, to think that I'm somehow a first generation person here, right? And you're thinking, whoa, I was trying to come with good intentions. I didn't realize that that was going to be sort of a trigger for you. So yeah, there is some risk taking. I want to be very frank with that. And I think that for some people, the downside, unfortunately, is what keeps us in our respective corners, because nobody wants to be accused of being racist. Nobody wants to be accused of being insensitive. Nobody wants to say the inappropriate thing. And I can only imagine if you come from a different country and you don't understand this country's, racial history, or if you don't understand our do's and don'ts, if you don't understand the way that race has been such an ugly issue. We have lots of axioms that we use in this country that if you're sort of an outsider, it will completely go over your head. I was just telling my wife today, we had an activity with some of our coworkers. We have a new woman who started working with us. She's just been in the country for about a year from China, and we were talking about pet peeves. And she told us that she had no idea what we were talking about when we said pet peeves. She said, I had to go on the internet and look it up because I didn't know what a pet peeve was. We have all these different sort of euphemisms and terms and catchphrases that we use that are common to us in the culture. But if you're an outsider, if you don't know those, you think, I don't want to even be more of an outsider. So I get and respect and totally understand the ways in which you may not feel comfortable having the conversation. But from the standpoint of raising a child, especially a younger child, I think the bottom line is where you can't go wrong is if you impress upon your children that you do not treat people differently or unfairly because they are of a different color than you. Or you don't treat people differently or unfairly because they have an accent or because they're here. You just don't do that. You treat other kids the ways that you want to be treated. That's the main sort of take home point here. Yes, we're different. Our differences are beautiful. We're made in different ways, and that's nothing we should be ashamed of. We should be proud of our skin, our hair, our eyes, our nose, all parts of who we are, but nobody should be treated differently or made fun of because they're different than anybody else. That's the message I think we want to convey to our kids over and over and over and over again. And the earlier we can start that message, the better.
Okay, before we move on to the next one, we have a young person in the audience who's 9 and who would like to know why people are still racist, which not an easy question to answer, but we do have a 9-year-old, and I feel like—
Yeah, because first of all, thank you, 9-year-old. Thank you for being part of our conversation. We wish we knew your name, but it says a lot about your learning that you are here. Why are people still racist? That's a great question. And I think people are racist because they just don't take the time to learn about other people. They just don't take the time to understand other people. And they don't take the time to understand that though we are different on the outside, we're very similar on the inside. And that we have to stop treating people differently and unfairly in a mean way because they're different. And I think that people like you are going to help us be better. That when we have people say that it's not okay to treat people different because of their race, that it's not okay. Part of what we need, and I will say this a lot, that when we see young kids being bullied, that we need other kids to stand up and say, that's not right. Don't do that. That's not fair. That's not how we treat people. We have to start telling people who are bullies, be it kids or adults, that that's just not okay. And if we can start telling people that, then maybe people will stop treating people unfairly, stop being racist, and treat people very nicely. That should be our goal.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, let me go into these last several tips and let folks get to their dinner if they haven't got to it yet. Tip number 6. Listen, folks, this is where it gets a little prickly. Discuss current events if and when you can in an age-appropriate fashion, because guess what? Your kids are talking about them. It is hard to shield information from kids today. It is just difficult. We are raising, I should say, many of you who have kids under the age of 12, you are raising digital natives. They have known these things their entire lives. There's these cell phones. I have a niece and a nephew who are both 6 years old. I'm amazed at the way that they navigate iPads, iPhones. They don't read directions. They don't ask for assistance. They know how to work these little devices as if they were born with them. Why? Because literally most of them learn how to work these devices from the time they were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months old. So they are accessing information in ways that we could never, ever think of. You know, I always make this comment that, look, my youngest son, who's 22, he for years when he was in middle school and high school, he could not fathom. He had a hard time wrapping his head around the fact there was once a time in this world, in a so-called modern society, when we did not have the internet. He just could not wrap his head around that. Like, how did you guys live in a world where you had no internet? Like, how did you get information? How did you know what was going on in the world? And I have to explain to him that we had these things called, and many folks know what I'm talking about. If you do, that means you're my age group. We had these things called encyclopedias. And encyclopedias were our internet, right? You had to go to the A book, the B book, but we couldn't afford to buy the entire set at one time. So we had the A book for like 2 years. Then we got the B book. So whenever my brother and I had to do a report, it usually had to be on something like the Amazon or Aardvarks or Alaska, because it took us seemed like 12 years to get the whole set, but I digress. But the bottom line is, the fact is he can't sort of wrap his head around the fact that there was a world without the internet, right? Well, guess what? These kids are growing up in a world where the internet is just everything, and it's everywhere, and the devices that they use and the way they navigate these devices. And even, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, folks, even when we think we put certain locks on, even we think we put certain safeguards on, don't be surprised if your brilliant children have already learned from other peers of theirs how to unlock those devices, how to unlock those guards. These are brilliantly the creative young people you have here, and their ability to dissect this information is amazing. So some of the very things that you think that they are not talking about, they are. Some of the very things that you think that they don't know about, they do. Some of the very topics you're trying to shield them from, they've already been in it. So I think that we have to try to figure out what's appropriate, and that's the family by family decision about how we engage our kids in these conversations. So now let me take you to some controversial issues that kids 6, 7, 8, and 9, and 10 years old are seeing. And the question becomes, how do we talk to them about it? Case in point, let's go here, folks. How do you explain this? January 6th was a day in our country's history that was very ugly. And we saw things that many of us who probably thought we'd never see. Many of us probably said, let's turn off the TV, let's not watch the news, we don't want our kids to see it. But rest assured, your kids probably heard or found out about these things some kind of way. How do we explain this? And I think the goal here is to talk about what happened, not put any political slants on it, not to give political leans, that there were people who went to the Capitol who did some awful things to people, and they broke laws and they killed people, and that is not nice. So you have to be able to talk about these things, because if we don't fill in the gaps, guess what? Our kids will go to their peers and their peers will fill in the gap, right? How do we explain this, right? So we have this long history in this country around immigration, and we have criminalized certain populations for being here illegally, right? And we have kind of sort of depicted certain groups in particular. I'll just be frank for a second. People of Latin descent, we have kind of criminalized them for being rule breakers, and we live in a country of rules. I'm not politicizing this, but I ask, how do we have this conversation with students? And is it different from this conversation with our young people? Okay. If we're going to criminalize one, we got to criminalize the other. If we're going to give a pass to one, do we give a pass to the other? These are the kind of heavy issues that our kids are seeing, right? And we have to ask ourselves, how do we engage in a conversation around what happened on January 6th? How do we engage our young people in a conversation about immigration? Right? Especially living in Southern California, where it's a big, big, big issue, right? I think we have to be as frank as we can, as humanistic as we can, but at least to be as transparent as we can in terms of how we see these issues, because they're all too real. Let me give you another current event that we see happening, right? Last year, right around this time, we had, oh, where did it go? I think I went too far. We had this issue. We had the discussion around Black Lives Matter, right? And there were massive protests all across the country, all across the world, calling for the end of systemic racism, calling for the end of the killing of innocent Black people. And what was so beautiful to me about what we saw during the spring of 2020 was that this was a multiracial, multi-ethnic sort of conglomeration of people who were out marching, holding hands side by side, protesting peacefully. And so you might have a child of yours who says, what does Black Lives Matter mean, right? And part of what I know, you know, we know, is that some people are still uncomfortable with this term because they feel like, why can't all lives matter? Well, I think we have to be clear about the fact that Black Lives Matter has not said that only Black Lives Matter. It has not said that Black Lives Matter more. And it does, and I maintain that you can't say all lives matter until you acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. So again, how you have these conversations is going to be your individual choice, but the goal is to try to describe what happened. People are angry and they're mad and they're protesting because they see some very unfair things happening to Black people over and over and over again, and they want it to end, and they're trying to use their voice to bring that to an end, right? And I always use the example, I saw something great being done by one of the phenomenal high school students in one of your classes. I think was it PV High, or I forget what school it was, Lindsay, you have to remind me. They brought in this, they said, well, look, what do we do every November in this country? We wear pink ribbons. And we wear pink ribbons as a great symbol and a really sort of thoughtful gesture around bringing awareness to breast cancer. And bringing this symbol out around breast cancer and breast cancer awareness, it doesn't mean that lung cancer is not important. It doesn't mean that prostate cancer is not important. It doesn't mean that any other form of cancer is not important. It's just saying that for this month, we're going to put a focus and a spotlight on breast cancer because there are far too many women, very small number, but far too many women who are sadly losing their lives because of breast cancer. So just like we focus on a particular type of issue that's causing people to lose their lives when it comes to breast cancer, some would say is a parallel argument to why the focus on Black Lives Matter. So again, your older elementary age kids, you can explain that in ways that you might not be with your younger kids, but the goal is to still to engage. And I mentioned this one. I want to come back to this one because this is a more recent phenomenon. Well, it's not recent. It's been in the news of late. And it's sad to see because there's anti-Asian assaults, there's anti-Asian harassment, there's these senseless acts of violence happening towards Asian Americans for no other reason than the fact that they are Asian American. And we know this is in direct response, what we believe, to issues tied to coronavirus. Again, we need to talk to our young people to say that, you know what, this is not something that's right. This is not something that's appropriate. And the part that's troubling is that some accounts is that these are acts of hate that are being directed at Asian Americans from other groups of color. So this is where we see the ethnic racism as opposed to intra-racism. Racism cuts across all different shapes and forms. You can have Black people, you can have Latinx people, you can have Native American people who can be racist in their acts and words and gestures just as much as white people can. And when you see some of the anti-Asian hate that's happening in our county, in our city, in our state, where we're supposed to be a progressive state, California, We're supposed to be a more inclusive state in California. We're supposed to be a so-called more tolerant state in California. To see the kind of anti-Asian hate happening is just wrong. Talking to our kids about it, saying that it's not okay. Not that we want to scare kids who might be Asian American about this, but nonetheless, I think it's still important. It's in the news, it's in the media, it's a current event, and lots of our kids are seeing this, and we want to help them to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and why it's wrong, okay? And then here's the tip number 7 I would give you. Keep talking, keep talking, keep talking. These are not one-time conversations. These are not one-offs. These are not, we're going to talk about it every other Monday. This is not, we're going to talk about it only in February. This is just something that you have to do. Keep the lines of communication open with your young people. They're curious, they're inquisitive, they're brilliant, they're resourceful, they're thinking, they're processing, they're watching, they're observing, they're listening. They're trying to figure out their world. And you, as their parents, are one of their most important sounding boards. So if they don't have you, or they don't see you as sort of an entity to go to, then they will find other places to go, and you may not like, or you may not approve some of those other places that they go. So I'll conclude on this, that for those of you who are tired of hearing about racism, imagine how much more tired we are constantly experiencing it. That's a quote from Barbara Smith that I think is so apropos. I will stop there and say, let's see if we have any questions and answers in the remaining time that we have. Dr. G?
We have two. One's, I think, a quick question. Can you explain why racial or cultural monoliths, even good ones, are a bad idea?
They're a bad idea because there is variation within groups. There's no one type of any people. White people have variations amongst themselves. Black people, Asian people, Latinx people, we all have variations within groups. And so when we create the monolith, we are assuming that there's a one size fits all, or one descriptor fits all. That's just not the case. That's how stereotypes are formed, and that's what contributes to racism. When we see one person and we generalize that one person to an entire group. Cannot do it, should not do it. That's hurtful, that's harmful. We're better than that.
All right, and our last question, how do we uplift our students of color while at the same time explaining our country's ugly racial and ethnic history? In other words, how can we explain our history without making them feel bad about themselves or impacting their self-esteem?
Yeah, I think we have to do it in a way that says that they are not victims, but they're victors. I think we have to talk about these ugly incidents in our nation's past, but talk about the incredible resilience that groups of color have shown. Talk about the incredible sort of resistance that there was always fighting for justice. There were always efforts to eradicate the wrongs in our society. So we can talk about these ugly episodes in our nation's history, but we typically talk about them in a way that makes it sound like people were just constant victims, which they were victims. Let me be clear. I don't want to sort of not make that point, but there were also people who fought for better, who stood up for righteousness. And I think we have to kind of nuance the conversation. We have to talk about these events in a way that's not sort of so downtrodden and sad. I mean, some folks have written about the fact that let's talk about the joy that exists for communities of color, right? There is happiness in the struggle. There's happiness in the accomplishment. There's happiness and joy in the way in which various groups who have been historically marginalized continue to fight to be seen and heard and to be represented. So I think we have to sort of frame it carefully because it can be sort of a heavy, emotional, downtrodden kind of way of how we think about history. But I think we have to think about how we kind of tell a more complete story and talk about the fact that we don't want people of color to feel like it's all sort of doom and gloom, but there are also some celebrations and achievements and accomplishments that are also important to acknowledge as well.
So that was our last question, our last formal question. Did you have a list of children's literature that you wanted to share?
I did, and I was trying to find it, Lindsay, and I was looking for it.
It's okay. If you want to send it to me,
yes,
we can put something together and we can share it out with our community.
Yes, I will send that to you. I'm looking right now. I didn't have it in my slide deck. Forgive me for that.
Awesome. Okay. So that's all of our formal questions. So thank you. I think, this has been very informative for all of us who have attended the series and for all of our parents. So we appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. You all have a good evening.
All right. And we will be in touch soon.
Thank you, Dr. G.
Okay.
Bye-bye.